Jake Morrison never thought he would end up reading stories to alien children. He was a soldier, not a teacher. But here he was, standing in front of a classroom full of young beings from 12 different worlds. The room was on Station Kepler 442, a huge space station that floated between the stars. The classroom looked like nothing Jake had ever seen on Earth. The walls were made of some kind of clear material that showed the stars outside. The desks were different shapes and sizes to fit different kinds of alien bodies. Some students sat on regular chairs, others floated in special containers filled with gas, and a few hung from the ceiling on silk threads. Jake had volunteered for the Galactic Education Initiative 6 months ago. It was a new program where humans and aliens tried to learn about each other. The military thought it would be good for relations between Earth and the other worlds. Jake thought it would be an easy job. He was wrong about that. The strangest thing about his new job was the Zalathi cubs. They were small alien children that looked like a mix between cats and teddy bears. They had soft purple fur and big golden eyes that seemed to glow in the dim light. Their ears were large and pointed, always moving to catch sounds from around the room. They had tiny hands with small claws that they used to grip things. Every time Jake came to read stories, the Zalathi cubs would rush to the front of the classroom. They would push past the other alien children and grab the seats closest to where Jake stood. They would sit there with their big eyes fixed on him. Not moving, not talking, just waiting for him to start reading. This was very strange behavior for Zalathi children. Jake had read about their species before coming to the station. Zalathi were known for being very careful and scared of new things. Their children usually stayed close to their own kind and watched strangers with fear. They did not trust easily, especially beings from other worlds. But these cubs acted differently around Jake. They seemed to forget all their natural fear when he was in the room. They would lean forward in their seats, getting as close to him as possible. Sometimes the smallest ones would even climb onto their desks to be nearer to his voice. Professor Varick was the main teacher for the class. He was from a species called the Ethereal Collective. His body was made of living crystal that changed colors when he thought different thoughts. He was very old and very smart, and he had been teaching alien children for hundreds of years. Even he could not understand why the Zalathi cubs acted so strangely around Jake. Professor Varick would stand at the back of the room during Jake's reading sessions. His crystal body would glow with curious blue light as he watched the cubs. Jake could tell the professor was thinking hard about something, but Varick never said what it was. The other alien children in the class were interesting too. There were small blue creatures that looked like walking water balloons. They came from a world that was mostly ocean. There were tall, thin beings with 4 arms and no eyes who could sense heat instead of seeing light. There were fuzzy creatures that looked like walking dandelions, floating children made of gas, and many others. All of these different children got along well with each other. They played games together during break time and shared food from their home worlds, but they all stayed with their own groups when Jake read stories. Only the Zalathi cubs broke this rule. Jake tried to understand why the cubs liked him so much. He was not particularly good with children, even human children. He had no brothers or sisters, and he had spent most of his adult life on military ships. He knew nothing about taking care of young beings, but something about reading stories felt natural to him. Maybe it was because his grandfather used to read to him when he was small. His grandfather had a deep, warm voice that made Jake feel safe and happy. Jake tried to read the same way his grandfather had, with feeling and care. The stories Jake read came from many different worlds. Some were about brave heroes fighting monsters. Others were about friendship and family. Some were funny stories that made all the children laugh. The cubs seemed to like all the stories, but they liked the quiet, gentle ones the best. When Jake read these peaceful stories, something amazing happened to the cubs. Their breathing would slow down and become deep and steady. Their big ears would stop moving around and point only at Jake. Their golden eyes would become soft and dreamy. Some of the smallest cubs would curl up in their chairs like they were getting ready to sleep. This worried Jake a little. He knew that Zalathi children never relaxed completely unless they felt totally safe. In the wild, Zalathi cubs always watched for danger. They always kept one ear listening for the sounds of predators. They never let their guard down around strangers. But these cubs seemed to forget all about being careful when Jake read to them. They acted like they were at home with their parents, not in a classroom full of aliens. This made Jake wonder if he was doing something wrong, or if there was something about humans that the cubs could sense. Jake decided to ask Professor Varick about it. But the crystal being was always busy with other things. The station was huge and full of diplomats, scientists, and teachers from hundreds of different worlds. Everyone had important work to do, and Jake did not want to bother the professor with what might be a silly question. Still, Jake could not stop thinking about the cubs. Every night, he would go to his small room on the station and wonder what made them trust him so much. He would look out his window at the stars and think about home. Earth seemed very far away, and he sometimes felt lonely among all these strange beings. But when he was in the classroom with the cubs sitting in front of him, listening to his voice with complete trust, Jake felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The cubs made him feel important and needed in a way that being a soldier never had. They reminded him that sometimes the most important job was not fighting or protecting, but simply being there for someone who needed comfort. Jake did not know it yet, but his question about the cubs would soon lead to a discovery that would change how humans were seen throughout the galaxy. For now, he was just a man reading stories to children who seemed to love the sound of his voice. 3 weeks after Jake started reading to the alien children, Professor Varric finally asked the question that had been bothering him. It happened in the station's observation deck, a huge room with windows that showed the stars and planets around them. Jake was sitting there after dinner drinking coffee and looking at the view. Professor Varric came into the room, his crystal body glowing with soft purple light. This meant he was curious about something. Jake had learned to read the professor's color changes over the past few months. Purple meant questions, blue meant thinking, red meant worry, and green meant he was happy. Lieutenant Commander Morrison, Professor Varric said in his strange musical voice. May I join you? Jake nodded and pointed to the chair across from him. Professor Varric did not really sit like humans did. His crystal body just changed shape to fit the chair. It was one of the many things about aliens that Jake was still getting used to. I have been watching your reading sessions with great interest, Professor Varric said. His body was now glowing brighter purple. There is something I must ask you about the Zalathi cubs. Jake put down his coffee cup and looked at the professor. He had been expecting this conversation for weeks. What about them? Why do they always sit in the front row when you read? Professor Varric asked. This behavior is very unusual for their species. In my 300 years of teaching, I have never seen Zalathi children act this way around a stranger. Jake thought about this question. He had noticed the same thing, but he had not really understood why it was so strange. Maybe they just like stories, he said. Professor Varric's crystal body flashed red for a moment, which meant he was concerned. It is much more than that, human. You do not understand what you are seeing. Zalathi cubs are some of the most careful creatures in the galaxy. They never trust strangers. They always stay alert for danger. They keep close to escape routes. But when you read to them, they forget all of this. Jake felt a strange feeling in his stomach. What do you mean? I mean they act like they are completely safe, Professor Varric explained. They stop watching the doors. They stop listening for danger sounds. They relax their bodies completely. Some of them even fall asleep. This only happens when Zalathi cubs are with their own parents in their home nests. This news made Jake uncomfortable. He did not want to be doing anything that might hurt the cubs or put them in danger. Should I stop reading to them? He asked. Professor Varric's body changed to blue, which meant he was thinking hard. No, I do not think you should stop. The cubs are not in any danger. But I am very curious about why they trust you so much. There must be something about humans, or about you specifically, that makes them feel safe. Jake tried to think of what that might be. He was not particularly gentle or quiet. He was a soldier, trained to fight and give orders. He had never been especially good with children, even human children. I really don't know, he said. I just read the same way my grandfather used to read to me. Tell me about your grandfather, Professor Varric said. Jake smiled, remembering the old man who had raised him after his parents died. He was a farmer in Ohio. He had a deep voice and he always made the stories sound exciting. He would change his voice for different characters and make sound effects for the action parts. But when he read quiet stories, his voice would get very soft and warm. Professor Varric's crystal body began to pulse with different colors. This meant he was having new ideas. Interesting. And you try to read the same way? I guess so, Jake said. It just feels natural. The cubs respond most strongly to your quiet, gentle voice, Professor Varric observed. When you read action stories with loud voices, they become slightly more alert. But when you read peaceful stories in your soft voice, they relax completely. Jake had noticed this too, but he had not thought much about it. Maybe they just prefer calm stories. Perhaps, Professor Varick said, but his purple glow showed he was still very curious. But I think there is more to it than that. I have been studying interspecies communication for my entire life. Each species has evolved different ways to signal safety and danger to their young. I believe your human voice might be accidentally copying one of these signals. This idea was fascinating and a little scary. Jake had never thought that his voice might have special effects on alien children. What kind of signal? That is what I hope to discover, Professor Varick said. Would you be willing to help me study this? It could be very important for understanding how different species can communicate and trust each other. Jake agreed, though he was not sure what kind of studying the professor had in mind. He just wanted to make sure the cubs stayed safe and happy. Over the next few days, Professor Varick began watching Jake's reading sessions more carefully. He brought special instruments that could measure sound waves and record the cubs' behavior. Jake felt a little strange being studied like this, but he tried to read normally. The professor also started asking Jake to try different things during story time. Sometimes he asked Jake to read louder, sometimes softer. Sometimes he asked him to change the speed of his voice or the way he pronounced certain words. Jake felt silly doing these experiments, but the cubs did not seem to mind. What they discovered was very interesting. When Jake spoke in his normal voice, the cubs were attentive but alert. When he made his voice louder or sharper, they became nervous and moved back in their seats. But when he made his voice very soft and gentle, with a slight rumbling quality, the cubs became completely relaxed. Professor Varick was especially interested in this rumbling quality. He recorded Jake's voice many times and studied the sound patterns with his instruments. He also compared these patterns to recordings of Zalathi parent voices that he had collected over the years. What he found surprised both of them. When Jake read in his gentlest voice, the sound waves were very similar to the purring sounds that Zalathi parents made to comfort their cubs. Jake was accidentally making the same kind of noises that told Zalathi children they were safe and protected. "This is remarkable," Professor Varick told Jake after showing him the recordings. "Your species has a natural ability to mimic safety signals from other species. This could explain why the cubs trust you so completely." Jake stared at the wave patterns on Professor Varick's screen. They looked almost identical. "So I'm basically purring at them without knowing it?" "In a way, yes," Professor Varick said, his crystal body glowing bright green with excitement. "This discovery could change everything we know about interspecies communication. If humans can naturally produce comfort signals for other species, it could revolutionize diplomacy and cooperation throughout the galaxy." Jake felt overwhelmed by this news. All he had wanted to do was read some stories to children. Now Professor Varick was talking about changing the galaxy. It seemed too big and important for someone like him. But when he looked at the cubs the next day, sitting in their front row seats with their golden eyes fixed on him with complete trust, Jake realized that maybe big changes could start with small things. Maybe the most important discoveries came not from laboratories or battlefields, but from classrooms where different species learned to trust each other one story at a time. Jake decided he needed to understand exactly what was happening with the cubs. Professor Varick's explanation about sound waves and safety signals made sense, but Jake wanted to see it for himself. He began watching the cubs more carefully during his reading sessions, looking for small details he might have missed before. The first thing he noticed was how the cubs breathed when he read to them. At the beginning of each session, when they first sat down, their breathing was quick and shallow. Their little chests moved up and down rapidly, like they were nervous or excited. But as soon as Jake began reading in his gentle voice, their breathing changed. It became slow and deep, like they were falling asleep. Jake could see their small bodies relaxing in their chairs. Their shoulders dropped, their hands unclenched, and their faces became peaceful. It reminded him of how human babies looked when their mothers sang lullabies to them. The cubs' ears were even more interesting to watch. Zalathi had very large ears that could move in different directions at the same time. Usually, the cubs kept one ear pointed toward Jake and the other ear turned toward the rest of the room. This way, they could listen to the story but still hear if anything dangerous was happening around them. But during Jake's quiet reading sessions, both ears would slowly turn toward him. The cubs would stop listening for danger completely. All their attention would focus on his voice. Jake had read that this was something Zalathi cubs only did when they were in their family nests, surrounded by parents and siblings who could protect them. The most amazing thing happened with the youngest cubs. These were the smallest ones in the class, probably only 4 or 5 years old in human terms. When Jake read gentle stories about friendship or family, these little cubs would actually curl up in their chairs and close their eyes. A few times, Jake was sure they had fallen completely asleep. Professor Varric had told him this was impossible. Zalathi cubs never slept outside their family groups. They were too afraid of being vulnerable, but here they were, sleeping peacefully while Jake read about magical forests or kind dragons who helped lost travelers find their way home. Jake decided to test what Professor Varric had discovered about his voice. During his next reading session, he chose an adventure story about space pirates. Instead of reading it in his usual gentle way, he made his voice louder and more dramatic. He emphasized the exciting parts and made sound effects for the space battles. The cubs' reaction was immediate. They sat up straighter in their chairs and looked around the room nervously. Their ears started swiveling again, checking for dangers. The smallest cubs opened their eyes and uncurled from their comfortable positions. They did not seem frightened exactly, but they were definitely more alert and careful. Jake felt bad about making them nervous, so he switched to a quieter story about a peaceful garden where flowers could talk to each other. As soon as he returned to his soft, gentle voice, the cubs relaxed again. Their breathing slowed down, their ears focused on him, and the little ones curled back up in their chairs. This experiment proved that Professor Varric was right. Jake's voice really was affecting the cubs in a special way, but understanding this made Jake feel both proud and worried. He was happy that he could make the cubs feel safe, but he was concerned about the responsibility this gave him. Jake decided to talk to Dr. Susan Clark about his discovery. Susan was the only other human on the station, and she was a psychologist who studied how different species thought and felt. She had been Jake's friend since they went to the academy together, and he trusted her advice. They met in the station's recreation center, a large room where the different species could relax and play games. Susan was sitting at a chessboard waiting for him. She was a small woman with short brown hair and kind eyes. She always seemed to understand people, whether they were human or alien. "You look troubled," Susan said as Jake sat down across from her. "What's going on?" Jake told her about the cubs and Professor Varric's discovery. He explained how his voice seemed to make the cubs feel safe, and how they would even fall asleep during his reading sessions. Susan listened carefully, asking questions and making notes on her tablet. "This is fascinating," Susan said when Jake finished his story, "but I can tell you're worried about something." "What is it?" Jake moved a chess piece without really thinking about the game. "I'm concerned about the responsibility. What if I accidentally hurt them somehow? What if my voice stops working and they get scared? What if other humans can't do this and the cubs become disappointed?" Susan smiled and moved her own piece. "Jake, you're overthinking this. You've discovered something wonderful about human voices and alien communication. Instead of worrying about all the things that could go wrong, think about all the good this could do." "What do you mean?" Jake asked. "Think about it," Susan said. "What makes human speech different from how other species communicate?" Jake thought about this while studying the chessboard. He knew that different alien species had very different ways of sharing information. The ethereal collective, like Professor Varric, used crystal resonance to send thoughts directly to each other. The insect-like hive species communicated through chemical smells. The gas-based nebula folk used electrical pulses that humans could not even detect. "We use our voices," Jake said slowly. "We change the pitch and tone and volume to express emotions." "Exactly," Susan said, moving her bishop. "Human voices are incredibly flexible. We can imitate sounds from nature, copy other people's speech patterns, and express complex emotions through tone alone. Most alien species have much more limited vocal ranges." Jake was beginning to understand. "So because human voices are so flexible, we might accidentally copy the vocal patterns that other species use to comfort their young?" "That's my theory," Susan said. "You discovered this with the Zalathi cubs, but I bet if we tested it, we would find that humans can produce comfort signals for other species too. We just need to learn what those signals are." This idea was both exciting and overwhelming. Jake had never thought of human voices as being special in this way. He had always assumed that the ability to speak different languages was useful for diplomacy, but he had never considered that the sounds themselves might have special meaning to aliens. There's something else, Susan continued. You mentioned that you learned to read from your grandfather. Human storytelling traditions might be especially good at creating these comfort signals. When we tell stories, we naturally use soothing tones and rhythms. We've been doing this for thousands of years to calm our own children. Jake remembered his grandfather's voice again. The old man had never known he was creating comfort signals for alien species that had not even been discovered yet. He had just been trying to make a scared little boy feel safe and loved. Maybe that was all Jake was doing too, just on a larger scale. So what should I do? Jake asked. Susan captured one of his pawns and smiled. Keep reading to those cubs, but also start paying attention to how other species react to human voices. This could be the beginning of something much bigger than you realize. Jake nodded, feeling better about his discovery. Maybe Professor Varick was right about this changing interspecies communication. Maybe human voices really could help different species trust each other. And maybe it all started with a simple desire to make children feel safe, whether they were human or alien. As Jake walked back to his quarters that night, he thought about the cubs who would be waiting for him tomorrow, ready to sit in the front row and listen to his voice with complete trust. He felt honored to be part of their education and excited to see where this discovery might lead. The breakthrough came during a story about Earth's ancient forests. Jake was reading about mighty oak trees that had weathered storms for hundreds of years, their deep roots keeping them strong through wind and rain. His voice had naturally fallen into the gentle, rumbling tone that the cubs loved most. As he read about the peaceful forest, Jake noticed something extraordinary happening in the front row. The smallest cub, a tiny female named Zira who was barely old enough for school, had completely curled up in her chair. Her breathing was so slow and deep that Jake was certain she had fallen asleep. But what amazed him even more was how the other cubs were reacting to their sleeping nestmate. In the wild, Zalathi cubs would normally panic if one of their group became vulnerable like this. They would wake the sleeping cub and move to a safer location. Instead, these cubs had formed a protective semicircle around little Zira. The older cubs positioned themselves between Zira and the rest of the classroom, but they did not seem worried or alert. Their body language was calm and protective, like they were guarding their little sister while she napped safely at home. Their ears remained pointed toward Jake's voice, showing they still felt completely secure. Jake continued reading, but his mind was racing. The cubs were not just feeling safe around him anymore. They were creating a family-like bond with each other, using his voice as the anchor that made it possible. They trusted him so completely that they were willing to let their guard down even to protect each other. When Jake finished the story, he spoke very quietly so he would not wake Zira. The other cubs seemed to understand and carefully gathered their things without making noise. One of the older cubs, a male named Keth, gently nudged Zira awake. She looked around with sleepy golden eyes, saw Jake smiling at her, and gave him a little wave with her tiny clawed hand. After the cubs left for their next class, Professor Varick approached Jake with his crystal body glowing bright blue. This meant he was having important thoughts. Did you see what happened with the sleeping cub? Professor Varick asked. Yes, Jake said. They protected her while she slept. I've never seen anything like it. Professor Varick's colors shifted to purple with excitement. What you witnessed is called nest behavior. It only occurs when Zalathi cubs feel completely safe in their environment. They form protective groups around the most vulnerable members of their family. The fact that they did this in a classroom full of aliens is unprecedented. Jake sat down heavily in his chair. The weight of what was happening was starting to sink in. So it's not just my voice that makes them feel safe. They're starting to see this classroom as their home. More than that, Professor Varick said. They are beginning to see you as a parent figure. In Zalathi culture, only parents can create the kind of safety that allows for nest behavior. The cubs have essentially adopted you into their family structure. This news filled Jake with wonder and terror at the same time. He felt honored that the cubs trusted him so much, but he also felt the enormous responsibility of their faith in him. What if he let them down? What if he had to leave the station? What if something happened to him? Professor Varick seemed to sense Jake's concerns. I know this is overwhelming, but you should know that what you have accomplished here is truly remarkable. In 3 centuries of interspecies contact, no non-Zalathi has ever achieved this level of trust with their young. You have done something that our best diplomats and scientists thought was impossible. Over the next few days, Jake began to notice other changes in the cubs' behavior. They started bringing him small gifts, pretty stones, drawings, and pieces of their lunch that they thought he might enjoy. They would wait for him outside the classroom before reading time, clustering around his legs like human children might do with a beloved teacher. The other alien children in the class began to notice these changes too. At first, some of them seemed jealous of the attention Jake gave to the cubs, but gradually they started to relax around him as well. The blue water creatures would splash happily when he read exciting parts of stories. The fuzzy dandelion beings would change colors to match the mood of the tales. Even the gas children would swirl in pretty patterns when Jake used his gentle voice. Jake realized that his effect was not limited to just the Zalathi cubs. His human voice seemed to have a calming influence on many different species of young aliens. Each species responded differently, but they all seemed to find something comforting in his vocal patterns. This discovery excited Professor Varric so much that he asked permission to record Jake's reading sessions and share them with researchers throughout the galaxy. Jake agreed, though he felt strange about the idea of scientists studying his voice like it was some kind of scientific phenomenon. Word of Jake's abilities began to spread beyond the education station. Diplomats and researchers from different worlds sent messages asking for more information. Some wanted to visit the station to see Jake's reading sessions for themselves. Others asked if humans could be sent to their worlds to work with their own young. The attention made Jake uncomfortable. He had never wanted to be famous or important. He had just wanted to read stories to children and help them learn about different cultures. Now people were talking about his voice like it was some kind of miracle cure for interspecies mistrust. Dr. Susan Clark helped him deal with the pressure. During their chess games, she reminded him that fame was not the important part of what he had discovered. "You've found something beautiful about human nature," she told him. "We have a natural ability to comfort and protect young beings, even if they're not our own species. That's not just scientifically interesting, it's morally important." "What do you mean?" Jake asked, moving his knight to protect his king. "Think about what this says about humans as a species," Susan said. "We're not just good at fighting or building technology. We're naturally nurturing. We instinctively want to help vulnerable creatures feel safe. That's a remarkable trait for a species to have." Jake had never thought about it that way. He had always seen his gentleness as a weakness, something that made him less effective as a soldier. But maybe Susan was right. Maybe the ability to comfort others was actually a strength. As Jake thought about this, he remembered something his grandfather used to say. "The strongest people are the ones who use their strength to protect those who can't protect themselves." His grandfather had been talking about standing up to bullies, but maybe the same principle applied to interspecies relations. The next day, when Jake saw little Zira curl up in her chair during story time and watched the other cubs form their protective circle around her, he understood what Professor Varric meant about the importance of his discovery. He was not just reading stories to alien children. He was helping create a new kind of family that crossed the boundaries between species. When Professor Varric asked his question again, why the cubs sat up front, Jake finally had a complete answer. They sat up front because his voice made them feel like they were home. They trusted him because his human vocal patterns accidentally mimicked the safety signals their own parents used to comfort them. And they formed nest behavior because he had somehow become, in their minds, a protector and caregiver. It was a beautiful accident that revealed something profound about what it meant to be human in a galaxy full of different kinds of life. Humans might not be the strongest or smartest species, but they had something equally valuable: the ability to make others feel safe and loved, no matter how different they might be. 6 months after Professor Varric first asked his question, Jake's small classroom had become the most famous room on Station Kepler 442. Delegates from across the galaxy came to observe his reading sessions. Scientists recorded his voice patterns and studied the cubs' responses. Diplomats took notes on interspecies cooperation and trust building. But for Jake, the most important thing was still the moment each day when the cubs would rush to the front row, their golden eyes bright with anticipation, waiting for him to open a book and transport them to new worlds with his voice. The cubs had grown braver and more confident over the months. Little Zira, who used to be too shy to speak in class, now raised her hand to ask questions about the stories. Keth, the older cub who protected the others, had started reading simple books on his own, trying to copy Jake's gentle tone when he read to the younger cubs. The change in the cubs had inspired changes throughout the station. Other human volunteers had arrived to work with different species children. Each human had to learn special techniques to comfort their assigned species. But they all used the same basic principle that Jake had discovered. Human voices could naturally produce comfort signals for alien young. Dr. Elizabeth Hayes worked with the crystalline children from the Ethereal Collective. She learned to sing in harmonic frequencies that made their crystal bodies glow with peaceful colors. Commander Robert Stone read to the insect-like hive younglings, using buzzing tones that mimicked their parent workers' caring sounds. Lieutenant Maria Santos specialized in the gas children, learning to modulate her voice to create soothing electrical patterns in their cloudy bodies. Each human reader discovered something new about interspecies communication. The water children responded to flowing, rhythmic speech that sounded like gentle streams. The plant-like younglings preferred soft, breathy voices that felt like wind through leaves. The rock children needed deep, resonant tones that vibrated through their stone bodies like earthquake songs. Professor Varick documented all these discoveries in reports that he sent throughout the galaxy. He called it the human comfort phenomenon and described it as the most significant breakthrough in interspecies relations since first contact between the various civilizations. But the real impact went far beyond. Scientific papers and diplomatic reports, children who had been afraid of strangers were now playing with beings from different worlds. Young aliens who had never left their home systems were learning about distant planets and cultures. Fear and suspicion were being replaced with curiosity and friendship, one story at a time. Jake received messages from his military commanders asking him to return to active duty. They wanted him to use his discovery to help with diplomatic missions and peace negotiations. Several alien governments formally requested that humans be assigned to their worlds to work with their children and help build trust between species. The requests were flattering, but Jake was not ready to leave his cubs. They had become his family in a way he had never expected. When he thought about leaving them, he remembered how he had felt when his parents died and his grandfather became the most important person in his world. He could not abandon the cubs who trusted him the same way. Dr. Susan Clark supported his decision to stay. During one of their chess games, she told him that his work was more important than any military mission he could be assigned to. "You're not just teaching aliens about humans," she said, moving her queen across the board. "You're teaching humans about themselves. You've shown us that our greatest strength isn't our technology or our fighting ability. It's our capacity to care for others even when they're completely different from us." Jake thought about this as he watched his cubs during their next reading session. They were listening to a story about brave explorers who traveled to unknown worlds, making friends with strange creatures, and learning that differences could be beautiful instead of frightening. The cubs hung on every word, their eyes wide with wonder at the possibilities the story described. Looking around the classroom, Jake saw that the other alien children were equally engaged. The blue water children were rippling with excitement. The fuzzy dandelion beings were glowing with happy colors. The gas children swirled in patterns that Jake had learned meant they were feeling joyful and safe. This was what interspecies cooperation really looked like, Jake realized. Not formal treaties or trade agreements, but young beings from different worlds sitting together in a classroom, sharing stories and dreams, learning that they were all more alike than different. After the reading session, little Zira approached Jake with something clutched in her small hands. It was a drawing she had made of Jake reading to all the different alien children. In the picture, Jake was surrounded by beings of every shape and color, all of them smiling or showing happiness in their own species' way. "This is for you," Zira said in her small, sweet voice, "because you make us all feel safe." Jake knelt down to her level and accepted the drawing. Looking at it, he saw himself through the cub's eyes, not as a soldier or a human, but simply as someone who cared about them and wanted them to be happy. It was the most beautiful gift he had ever received. Professor Varick joined them, his crystal body glowing with warm golden light that Jake had learned meant deep contentment. The instructor asked why the cubs sat up front, Professor Varick said, repeating his original question. And the human said, "They feel safe when I read." "That's right," Jake replied, still holding Zira's drawing. "But now I understand that the answer is much deeper than we first realized," Professor Varick continued. "They feel safe because you have taught them that being different is not something to fear. You have shown them that kindness can cross any boundary between species. You have given them the most precious gift possible, the knowledge that they are not alone in the universe." Jake looked around at all the young beings who had gathered around him. Cubs and crystalline children and water beings and gas creatures. All different, all unique, all trusting him with their safety and their dreams. He thought about his grandfather, who had never known that his gentle voice and loving stories would someday echo across the galaxy, bringing comfort to children he could never have imagined. "They feel safe when I read," Jake said again, "because that's what stories are for. They're for building bridges between different worlds, different hearts, different dreams. They're for reminding us that no matter how far apart we might be, we all need the same things: love, safety, and someone who cares enough to share a good story." As the cubs gathered around him for one more story before the day ended, Jake realized that he had found his true purpose. He was not just a soldier anymore, or even just a teacher. He was a bridge builder, a dream weaver, a keeper of the universal truth that kindness could make anyone feel at home, no matter how far from home they might be. The cubs settled into their favorite spots in the front row, their golden eyes bright with anticipation, and Jake opened his book to begin another journey to another world, carrying his small family of many species along on the wings of his voice. Outside the classroom windows, the stars watched and waited, full of other worlds where other children might someday learn that they too could feel safe when someone who cared about them took the time to read them a story.